Hi. You're probably aware, but we've currently got running a game design challenge sponsored by War Games Atlantic. In this video, I'm going to talk you through my thoughts, my processes in my design. I'm going to enter into that challenge. A bit of a design diary. So without further ado, hi. A few months back, Malev in our Discord suggested the idea of a challenge being to design a game based around a single box of miniatures. With some hard work and some networking, he's built this into a challenge that has been sponsored by War Games Atlantic, who are going to give prizes to the top three voted for designs and are going to pick one out to publish on their website. So if you haven't yet gotten by the Discord and gotten involved, swing by now, sign yourself up, get designing something simple. The challenge closes on the 1st of October, so you've still got quite a while to put together a small one-box game. Obviously, I was inspired by this challenge, as many people were, and I started thinking about what I might do for a design. So first of all, I swung by the War Games Atlantic website and had a look at what boxes they had available. I found a lot of very inspiring boxes in there, loads of characterful, interesting options. Started with a long list of about 12 possible game ideas and eventually got it down to 3 ideas. The female cannon fodder box set, I was thinking it might be interesting to have a game where the cannon fodder are essentially being forced into war by a commissar, and whilst having to avoid incoming fire and fight back against the enemy, they're looking to get far and away enough from the commissar that they can eventually escape the detail without getting executed for obviously trying to get away. The other idea I had was using the werewolf set. I was thinking about a pack of wolves who are hunting after some sort of prey. You need to stay within contact of the pack, but not allow them to get so close that they're going to take your prey from you. And the third idea that I ultimately didn't go with was to use the Death Stranding civilian set. I've been interested for a while in the idea of civilians moving randomly and responding to a conflict. I thought it might be interesting for players to engage in a sort of unknown hidden cat and mouse idea where one of the civilians was actually an agent trying to escape or trying to manipulate the crowds, while the other player was trying to pick them out and arrest them. I didn't go with any of those ideas. The one I finally picked and the set that I chose was the World War One field hospital set. There's a few reasons for that, and it's interesting to me that a lot of the ideas that I was kicking around have been come to by other members of the challenge by an alternative route or in a different way. One of the things that inspired me was this book, Feminist War Games. It's a set of essays, chapters by different academics and designers on the possibility of a feminist war game. Rather than that necessarily being a game built around pushing feminist ideals, the book rather talks about the unseen costs of many conflicts, particularly many conflicts in games. We're all aware that wars affect civilian populations, affect non-combatants, but these are often glossed over by the war games that we play, avoided, minimalised, sidelined. We don't want to necessarily think about some of the harder realities and the difficult choices taken during war. I wanted to investigate that idea, look at some of the less examined parts of a conflict, and this challenge and the one box digital First World War field hospital set gave me the perfect opportunity to do that. While it might have been a more traditional standard choice to take something more conflict based, I felt like this was the perfect opportunity to investigate something less based around direct conflict, less based around direct combat, and to look at the civilian side, the other cost of war. And because of that, I chose to sort of put my money where my mouth is. I talk a lot about non-combat games, alternative viewpoints, alternative ideas, and on a small scale in a game like this is a perfect opportunity to investigate that. So I've chosen the First World War field hospital set. I Called my game Dulce et, a quote from the Wilfred Owen war poem Dulce et Decorum Est, a poem about the cost of war. A group of soldiers are hit by a gas attack. One of the members of the patrol is unable to get their gas mask on in time, and as they walk back to camp with him hanging off the back of the cart, gurgling and choking, the narrator of the poem ironically quotes the idea of Dulce et Decorum Est. It is good and fitting to die for your country. Obviously, that's quite a sort of heavy perspective to take for a simple small box war game, but I really wanted to try and reach to the idea of the difficulty, the cost, the pain and conflict that does come up in wartime. So I didn't want to get directly into designing the game as soon as I heard from Malev and had sort of settled on a box. I was trying to wait until the challenge was initially launched, but brains being what they are, my mind was churning away in the background, sort of working on the problems. And I came up with the first of the mechanics when I wasn't really trying to focus on the game. So one of the things I wanted to look at in the game is the idea that there are different skill sets, different viewpoints that can be valuable within conflict, within war, within life. In order to do that, I wanted to have a test, a standard way of making statistic tests in the game, where some of the individuals, some of the staff members would be extremely good at one sort of test with the exact same set of tools that made them extremely bad at certain other tests. The way I decided to do that was to take the standard set of what we might call RPG dice, the 6 dice including a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D20, and to split tests within the game into IQ tests and EQ tests. If you're not familiar with EQ, I assume you're familiar with the idea of IQ, the raw intelligence of an individual. EQ is the emotional intelligence an individual might possess. It's often said of certain politicians that get to a level of power that don't seem to match to their intellectual abilities, that they have high levels of EQ. It was often said, for example, that George W. Bush, when he walked into a room, knew the names of all the people in there, knew who to shake hands with, who to hug, who to pat on the shoulder. He had an instinctive emotional intelligence. He came across brilliantly as an individual, even though in some of his speeches he didn't come across as quite as intellectually adept as one might have expected. That's because he had a very high level of this EQ quotient, this emotional intelligence. I wanted to build a game that could show the difference between these two perspectives, between these two sets of abilities, and could so value people with very different skill sets and underline why it can be useful to have people of different perspective, different ideologies, different ways of thinking within any kind of desperate situation. The way I did this, the way I've attempted to do this, is that IQ tests you pass by rolling a 6 or more on the dice after using stats to modify it. EQ tests you pass by scoring the highest value that dice has available. So an individual using a D4 as their primary dice will, even without modifiers, pass the EQ test a quarter of the time and the IQ test essentially never. Meanwhile, somebody with a D20 will pass the IQ test extremely predictably, whereas the EQ test they'll almost always fail. There are a set of stats that modify this to make it so that D20s will succeed on their IQ tests about 3/4 of the time and fail on their EQ tests 3/4 of the time, and similarly for the D4s and the D6s, and obviously there's a range where you can meet in the middle. At the start of the game, the player has to assign a dice to each of the staff members, 3 nurses and 3 doctors, and therefore build a group of people who have very different capabilities because of the way that they inherently interact with the world. My next decision was to try and decide what exactly were going to be the capabilities, the capacities, and the differences between the doctors and the nurses within the game. Whilst I want to have something that challenges traditional viewpoints, there's no way of running a World War One game that has any idea of realism apart from by having the nurses be female and the doctors be male. Now, in the game, each individual has 2 different statistics: practicality and treatment or theory. Practicality is the stat that you use when collecting pills from the dispensary or firing a gun. And I'll get onto that in a second, the issue of the fact that there are weapons, there is shooting in the game to a certain degree. IQ tests are those that are used for diagnosing patients and working through more intellectual problems. What I decided was to give the nurses a high practicality score and the doctors a high theory score. What this means is that doctors are very good at diagnosing illnesses, but not necessarily quite as capable at performing the basic process of actually treating the patients, whereas the nurses excel in that. It also means that the nurses end up being better at shooting when there are conflicts. I was very happy with making that decision. To me, within the background, I have an idea that the nurses would come from upper class families. These would be ladies who from a young age have been going out on hunting parties. They've been learning to shoot from the moment they came out into the world. Whilst the doctors, I had an idea, were probably second sons, probably men who had spent a little bit longer studying in dusty halls and universities rather than going out into the world and looking for general approval from their peer group. So the women all know how to handle a gun, the doctors maybe less so. I also think it's an interesting idea to look at the fact that perceived physical muscle, heft, strength isn't necessarily massively relevant when the warfare that you're engaging in is based on pistols, rifles, guns, and range. Particularly in this game, as I said, there is shooting, but I didn't want to have a situation where there were actually enemy soldiers and combatants. Other than the reality of the fact that it's a war crime for doctors and nurses to fire back at enemy combatants, I didn't want to engage with the idea of conflict and othering that can take place in a direct versus gun battle. So one of these scenarios within the game, because of the general destruction that occurs during war, because of platoons or armies living off the lands and foraging as they're moving from place to place, the natural order has been disrupted, as happens in reality, and as is a reflection on the wider, deeper impacts of a conflict such as the world wars, such as any major war or battle. And because of that, the local wildlife have become more desperate, more extreme. And there's a scenario where wolves are attacking the supplies of the field hospital. And the doctors and nurses have to both treat their patients while fending off these wild animals as they're coming to try and break into the tent looking for food, supplies, whatever. So there is a level of conflict and combat within the game without hopefully building the idea of direct oppositional forces and creating an idea that this is a moment of desperation. This is something that has affected the world as a whole, the surrounding countryside. This sort of war is a total war and it destroys and affects everything around it. So, with those sort of vague ideas in mind, it came time to launch the challenge, and I got working on the game in earnest. The first thing that came to my mind is that I didn't want to have tests simply being a roll of the dice alone. I also wanted to build in an idea of the pressures that a field hospital in this sort of situation would be under. Time pressures, pressures of focus and concentration, and frantic activity to save lives. It occurred to me that an interesting way of doing this, because I was looking particularly at a solo game or possibly a game of collaborative mode, is to create a timed effect and a dexterity element. So within the game, a single scenario has a time limit. It'll run for a set amount of time, and at certain points within that time, challenges will be triggered. Treating and comforting patients, fending off wolves, depending on which scenario you've taken. I wanted to do this, as I say, to reflect the pressures that the individuals would be under, and to put the player within that same level of pressure. You can create pressure in a game by giving people limited choices, limited resources, limited turns in which to do something. But I think that a literal ticking clock makes something much more personal, much more direct for the player, and that very much is what I was trying to go for here, to create the idea of panic and pressure and desperation, and to remove the somewhat intellectualized academic puzzle that solo games can often become. I didn't want to create a situation where dice rolling under pressure can become trivialized. To roll a dice multiple times within a short period is not necessarily particularly a test of skill, and it is something that can become frivolous and sort of without weight to it. Instead, I chose to build in, as I say, a dexterity element. So whenever you engage with a dispensary, with the armory, with a target, with a patient, you have to take a pen and physically draw onto the tabletop, onto the piece of paper that you'll be using to represent the ward. I'll talk about that a little in a second. Around the person making the interaction, across to the thing you're interacting with, and then around the element you're interacting with certain rules about going around the shape without going over the lines. So for me, this gives a very sort of direct, visceral sense of interacting with things under time pressure. Also, I wanted to reflect the nature of medicine as being sometimes, with ideas like surgery and examination, something that you physically do with your hands under time pressure, with very specific requirements of accuracy and specificity. And by having this element of drawing round pieces, I feel was a strong way of doing that. Also, it creates a situation where your tabletop becomes a record of what has gone on, what has occurred during play. Often when watching films, TV shows about medical procedures, medical dramas, the moments that are most affecting to me are the moments after the initial problem, the desperation has gone past, where you look at the detritus, the wreckage, the things that have been thrown aside in the desperation of the moment. I wanted to be able to give players the option at the end of a play session to look at the table and reflect and see what had happened. It's a small reflection of that idea of the detritus and the destruction and the moments of desperation, but it's the way that I chose to do it. So within play, you print out a couple of A4 pages that have the ward, the dispensary, and the hospital's mess marked on them. You place your miniatures directly onto these pieces of paper that you form together to build the hospital, and you physically move around the space within it with another dexterity element, and then draw onto these pieces of paper with marker pens as you make your interactions. It's a very physical, very direct, very visceral way, and I feel that it's somewhat transgressive to take your play area and to draw on it and to make notes on it as you're playing, to mark things, to cross them off, to make the play area one that you can't reuse. You can't sort of go back and use the same space over and over. Each of the engagements is its own self-contained, permanent and complete thing. I think that's something that's quite affecting. I think that by doing it with a couple of pages of printed A4 paper, it's not necessarily too costly to players. I didn't want to ask people to permanently affect or destroy physical terrain, something that could be valuable and hold a sort of a sense of pride in its creation. I wanted this to be something that was quite stark, quite temporary, and yet quite permanent at the same time. So the printed area that you play across is simple black lines. Your playing pieces stand within it as individuals within a sort of strange and alien space, but a space that they are deeply and inherently familiar with. The playset comes with, as I say, a set of doctors, a set of nurses, and of course a set of patients. The patients are, on the one hand, an object that you interact with during play, and I was worried about the inactivity, the non-specificity of those patients. I've built into the game a system of comforting the patients. When certain things happen, they can be triggered to be distressed, essentially suffering the symptoms of shell shock, a psychological phenomena that occurred during the First World War that may well essentially have been PTSD. At certain points, patients will be triggered in their distress. You comfort them, or they will suffer from their shell shock symptoms, making the game more difficult, making what you have to do more complex. I have wondered about whether that makes the patients too passive, too much of a problem, too much of something that you have to deal with rather than something that you have to empathize with. I think that the fact that you have to work through and attend to and comfort them with limited resources and limited times, and the fact that you may at certain points resent them, is only something that reflects the difficult emotions, the difficult feelings, the difficult realities that would have come up in these sorts of situations. There are people you have to care for your own and their well-being, but there are people whose well-being makes your life more difficult. And I hope that struggling with the dichotomy there is something that will give a relevance to the game. So yeah, that is where the game stands at the moment. Those are my thoughts on what drove me to put the various elements and various sort of features into it. I hope that's explained some of the thought processes between trying to create certain emotional reactions, certain events within the player. I think personally that game design is very much about the reactions that you want to build in your players, the feelings you want them to have, the events you want to experience them. I think that the best way to design a game is to come at it through asking, what do I want my players to think? What do I want them to feel? How do I want them to react in this situation? And designing mechanics and elements that push the emotions and the reactions and the events and the feelings that you want people to have, rather than a simple set of mechanics that build a even complex and interesting interactive puzzle on the tabletop. I think that the thing that games do most interestingly and effectively is to build moments of emotion and interaction. Okay, so that's where Dulce stands at the moment. It's available on the Rule of Carnage Discord to check out, download, playtest. I'd love some feedback for it. I'd love to see people playtesting it. I want to develop it some more. Particularly, I'd like to include a cooperative mode. Movement at the moment in the game is another dexterity element. You pin a thumb onto the table and use the rest of your hand to move the miniature around without moving your thumb. I'd love to find some way of coordinating different sets of hands to get those sorts of movements achieved. There are tons of challenge entrants also on the Discord. We've got, I think, over 60 entrants at the moment, all of whom would love feedback, love some playtesting information from people, would love you to swing by, give them some comments. There are all sorts of games of a massive variety of play styles, themes, ideas. I'm certain there's something in there you'll find really interesting and enjoyable. And, I strongly suggest that you go in and throw your hat in the ring. Design your own game. It's only a month and a half before the competition closes, so it's not a massive commitment. If you get something fully developed and enter it, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. You can just work on something, run through some of the ideas of designing with a whole community of people who are there to support you, give you feedback, give you ideas, run through things with you. So it's a supportive community environment for working through some game design ideas, which I think is a great opportunity and something you should totally engage with. Hopefully, if I make some more developments, get some more playtesting done, I'll make another one of these design diaries. As usual, next weekend there will be a game design chat between myself and Mike Hutchinson. But for now, from this solo episode, this solo developer's diary, this is going to be thank you and goodbye from Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.